Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. That is exactly how the Bible describes Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. For centuries, history has remembered the Assyrians as the ultimate villains of the ancient world, the Nazis of antiquity, masters of torture, inventors of psychological warfare, and the first nation to turn terror into state policy. But this image of blood and cruelty hides a much deeper, more complex tragedy. Because empires aren't born evil, they are made. Before the chariots and the massacres, the Assyrians were not warriors, they were merchants, they were scholars. They were a small people living on a flat, defenseless plain surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead. For 1,000 years, Assyria was the underdog, the victim. So the real question isn't why were they so cruel? The real question is, what happened to these people? What kind of trauma turns a nation of shopkeepers into the most ruthless conquerors the world has ever seen? Today, we discuss the rise of the very first true empire in human history. From the ashes of Sumer to the height of Nineveh, we will see how they invented the very concept of a superpower, standing armies, deportation, centralized bureaucracy, and heavy artillery. This is the story of how Assyria built the world and then drowned it in blood. This is the rise and fall of the Assyrian Empire. Let's start by doing something most Assyrian stories don't do. Let's rewind so far back that Nineveh isn't even the main character yet, and Assyria isn't a nightmare. It's basically a dot on the map trying to stay alive. When people hear Assyria, they picture walls, spikes, screaming prisoners, kings bragging in stone about how many cities they burned. But the Assyrians didn't wake up one morning and decide to become the ancient world's horror movie. They inherited a world that already knew how to be cruel. What they inherited, this is the key, was a set of tools: writing, bureaucracy, accounting, law, diplomacy, city government, temple economics, and the idea that power can be organized and repeated, not just improvised. All of that comes from the older southern world, Sumer and Akkad, the original Mesopotamian engine room. So before we can understand why Assyria became an empire, we need to understand the civilization whose ruins they were born into, because Assyria didn't rise out of nowhere. It rose out of the ashes of earlier experiments in power that were brilliant, fragile, and constantly at risk of collapsing. Mesopotamia, at a basic level, is a place where geography forces politics to be intense. The land between the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, can be insanely productive if you manage water well, if you coordinate labor, if you maintain canals, if you keep the peace long enough to plant and harvest. But it's also open. There aren't big protective mountain ranges wrapping the heartland like a wall. It's exposed, it's flat. And so, from very early on, the political logic is this: if you don't organize, somebody else will, and they'll organize against you. That's the world where the Sumerians built the first dense urban civilization. City-states like Uruk, Lagash, places that feel almost mythical now, are not just cities, they're political organisms. They have gods, they have priests, they have storehouses, they have courts, they have scribes whose job is literally to make the economy legible. And that's not a boring detail, that's the beginning of state power. Once you can record who owes what, who owns what, who delivered grain, who didn't, who's exempt, who's drafted, once you can put the world into clay and numbers, you can control it, you can scale it, you can survive crises better than your neighbors.
The Sumerians didn't invent every part of government, but they turned it into a system. Then comes Akkad, and Akkad is where you start seeing something closer to what we'd call imperial ambition. Sargon of Akkad. Sargon is one of those names that sounds like a title because it basically becomes one, builds a larger realm than any single Sumerian city-state ever could. And people argue, fairly, that Akkad is the first empire in history. They're not wrong if by empire you mean a polity that conquers and rules many cities and peoples beyond a single city's traditional territory. Akkad has a strong claim. But here's the problem. Akkad is also a lesson in how hard it is to hold an empire together for the long haul. It's early, it's experimental, it's dependent on the charisma and violence of a ruling house, it's vulnerable to drought, to internal conflict, to the fact that a lot of the conquered cities don't really love being conquered. And eventually, Akkad falls apart. After Akkad, Mesopotamia doesn't stop being civilized, it doesn't return to caves. What happens is more interesting. Power fractures, reforms, and people keep reusing the same administrative tools, the same cultural DNA, but under different rulers. That's the pattern we're going to see again and again, and Assyria is part of that pattern, not outside it. After the Akkadian collapse, there's a period of instability, new groups moving, old rivalries returning, climate stress probably playing a role, then a kind of comeback that historians often call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III. This is sometimes described as a Sumerian Renaissance, and that phrase isn't bad, because Ur III looks like a deliberate attempt to rebuild order, centralized administration, huge record-keeping, state-run labor, organized taxation. It's not just kings waving swords, it's scribes, schedules, quotas. It's a machine, and it works for a while. But machines can break when the environment changes or when the pressure becomes too much. Ur III collapses too, around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, and the collapse matters for our story because it creates the kind of political vacuum where a small northern city like Ashur can start to matter. When Ur falls, it's not replaced by a single neat successor. Instead, you get a competitive landscape, different city-states, different dynasties, shifting alliances, and a lot of movement of peoples, especially Amorite groups who become major players across the region. This is Mesopotamia as a constant political storm, and if you're trying to imagine what that feels like on the ground, think less one empire's timeline and more a market of power, where cities rise, fall, pay tribute, rebel, get punished, recover, and start the cycle again. In that world, survival is an achievement. Now, let's place Assyria in this. Early Assyria isn't Assyria the empire, it's Ashur the city, sitting on the Tigris in the north. That location matters. It's not deep in the rich southern alluvium where massive canal agriculture dominates everything, and it's not up in the mountains either. It's in a zone where agriculture exists, but trade matters more, where routes connect the Mesopotamian heartland to Anatolia, to metals, to timber, to things the South can't easily produce. And right away you should see what that implies. Ashur's strength isn't going to be endless fields and giant temple estates like the Deep South. Ashur's strength is going to be connection, mobility, commercial intelligence, relationships, paperwork, contracts, people who know how to negotiate and who know what things are worth. That's not a warrior's origin story, that's a merchant's origin story. And the other piece, Ashur is exposed. If you live in a flat, open landscape with aggressive neighbors, you can't afford to be romantic about war. You can't treat it like heroic theater. War is a pressure that can erase you. So early Assyria develops in an environment where caution and calculation are not personality traits, they're survival strategies. This is why I keep saying survivor. Ashur isn't born as a predator, it's born as a small state that has to navigate larger powers. And those larger powers shift constantly. After Ur-3 collapses, southern Mesopotamia becomes a patchwork. Essene, Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, eventually Babylon rising from being just another city to being a serious player. In between, you've got Elam to the east, you've got highland groups, you've got competition for trade routes, and in the north and west, there are other emerging powers that can squeeze Ashur from different angles. So when we ask, who were the Assyrians before the empire, the honest answer is, they were the people who learned how to exist in a permanent power struggle without being swallowed. They were the people who learned how to make themselves useful, economically, diplomatically, while staying armed enough not to be an easy meal. That's not a glamorous story, but it's the foundation for everything that comes later. And culturally, Ashur is not some alien outlier, it's Mesopotamian through and through.
Same writing system, same scribal culture, same religious framework with local flavors, same idea that kings rule with divine legitimacy, same worldview where the city's god is basically the city's identity. Later Assyrian propaganda will make it sound like Ashur the god is commanding global conquest, like the universe itself requires expansion. But at the beginning, Ashur the god is first and foremost the protector of a city that needs protection. That's a different vibe, and it matters. This is also a good moment to talk about legacy, because one thing that gets lost when people jump straight to the Neo-Assyrian horror show is that the Assyrians are heirs, not outsiders. They inherit Sumerian and Akkadian cultural capital the way later Europeans inherit Roman law. Not perfectly, not evenly, but with deep respect for the prestige of the past. Mesopotamian elites, whether in Babylon, in Ashur, anywhere, are obsessed with antiquity. They copy old texts, they preserve lists of kings, they treat the ancient past like a source of authority. So Assyria, even when it becomes terrifying, is still part of this broader Mesopotamian civilization. It's not civilization versus barbarians, it's civilization turning inward and weaponizing itself. Now, I don't want to skip a name that matters for how the map starts to change in this era. Shamshi-Adad first. He's not a Neo-Assyrian emperor, he's much earlier, but he's one of the first figures who shows you an Assyrian political ambition that reaches beyond just "don't die." Shamshi-Adad builds a larger kingdom in northern Mesopotamia, ties together territories, plays the alliance game, and for a brief moment, Assyria looks like it might become a regional heavyweight earlier than we expect, but it doesn't last. And that, again, is the pattern. Early expansions are fragile, dependent on individuals, vulnerable to the next wave of politics. His state collapses, and Assyria doesn't immediately bounce into empire mode. It goes back to being pressured, sometimes subordinated, sometimes squeezed by stronger neighbors. Which brings us to Babylon, and the figure everyone knows because of the code, Hammurabi. In popular memory, Hammurabi is the lawgiver, stone steel, justice, eye for an eye. In real political history, he's also a seriously skilled strategist who knows how to use alliances and timing to build Babylon into the dominant power in the south. And in that chess game, Assyria gets outplayed. Not necessarily because Assyrian kings are dumb, but because Babylon at that moment is positioned to turn southern resources into a coherent power base, and Hammurabi is good at exploiting rivalries. He doesn't just win with brute force,
He wins by picking the right fights at the right time, by neutralizing threats, by breaking coalitions. For Assyria, this period is a reminder that you can be smart, disciplined, even culturally sophisticated, and still end up on the wrong side of the region's power currents. That experience, being outmaneuvered by Babylon, seeing how quickly the political weather can turn, feeds a long-running tension between Assyria and Babylon that never fully goes away. And I want you to keep that tension in your head as a thread, because later, when Assyria is at its peak, Babylon will be both a prize and a problem, the prestigious southern city that Assyria cannot ignore, cannot fully tame, and cannot stop needing. Here's the part that often surprises people. This whole early period is not a straight climb upward, it's wobble. It's dependence, then partial independence, then dependence again. Babylon itself, after Hammurabi, doesn't become a stable, forever empire. It faces instability, succession issues, and shifting regional pressures. And in those moments, when Babylon is distracted or weakened, Assyria gets room to breathe. Independence in this world isn't always declared with fireworks. Sometimes it's just the moment you stop paying tribute because the guy who used to demand it has bigger problems.
So Assyria's return to independence is not one heroic revolution. It's a process that happens in the cracks of other people's crises. And this is where the ashes idea in the chapter title really lands. The older great states burn down, politically speaking, and the heat of that collapse reshapes the landscape. Ashur survives the smoke. Ashur learns. Ashur adopts and adapts. It's building something slowly, institutions, habits, expectations about what a king can demand from his people, how the state can mobilize resources. Even early on, you can see the beginnings of what will later become very Assyrian, an emphasis on organization, on accountability, on the idea that the state can reach into society in a systematic way. Not yet the giant deportation engine, not yet the professional imperial army, but the mentality starts forming. Survival comes from systems, not vibes. And because this is a lecture and not a museum plaque, let me put it in plain terms. Assyria's early story is basically a long training montage. It's a small city-state learning over centuries that the world is not forgiving. They're watching empires rise and fall around them. They're watching how wealth attracts predators. They're watching how alliances can save you or ruin you. They're watching how a single bad harvest or a single succession crisis can rewrite the map. They're also benefiting from something that sounds boring but is incredibly powerful: continuity. Mesopotamia has this deep bureaucratic continuity. The technologies of control, writing, accounting, archives don't vanish when a dynasty collapses. They get inherited. They get repurposed. That's why later, when Assyria finally flips into full imperial mode, it can scale so fast. It's not inventing the state from scratch in the 9th or 8th century BCE. It's taking 1,000+ years of Mesopotamian administrative evolution and then pushing it to an extreme. So there are three main things to remember. First, Assyria begins as a Mesopotamian heir, not a barbarian outsider. Second, it spends a long time as an underdog in a brutal, competitive landscape, trade-oriented, exposed, constantly managing threats. Third, the collapses of older powers, Akkad, UR3, later the shifting instability in the south, create a world where a survivor can become a contender. The empire is not the starting point. It's the outcome of centuries of pressure, inheritance, and adaptation. Before Assyria becomes the empire that terrifies everyone, the best evidence we have for what Assyrians were doing day to day is paperwork. Letters, contracts, receipts, loan agreements, shipping notes, complaints,
family drama. The stuff feels weirdly modern sometimes, like you're reading someone's inbox from 4,000 years ago, except it's on clay tablets. This is the Old Assyrian period, and the big headline is simple. They weren't conquering Anatolia, they were selling to Anatolia. They weren't dragging populations across the map, they were moving textiles, tin, and silver through an international trade network that was, for its time, insanely organized. If you want one location that captures this world, it's Kanesh, also known by its modern name, Kultepe, in central Anatolia. The Assyrians set up what we call a kurum there, basically a merchant quarter, a trade colony that's semi-autonomous, with its own rules, its own archive system, and a constant flow of goods and information back to Ashur. And I'm going to emphasize something that matters for your whole trauma to empire thesis. This isn't imperialism by conquest. There's no Assyrian army occupying Kanesh. They aren't planting governors and garrisons. They're doing business. It's influence, yes. It's leverage, yes. But it's commercial, not military. And that's why this chapter is so important. It proves in a very literal, documentary way that brutality was not in their DNA, like some kind of ancient curse. Their default skill set, early on, was trade, logistics, negotiation, credit, and law. Let's talk about what they traded, because it's not random. The Assyrians were middlemen in a world where different regions had different resources, and moving those resources safely was basically the difference between prosperity and stagnation. Mesopotamia is great for agriculture, textiles, and organized urban production, but it's not great for certain raw materials. Metals are the obvious one. Tin is crucial because tin plus copper gives you bronze, and bronze is everything in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Tools, weapons, prestige goods, basically the backbone of a whole technology system. Anatolia has access to metals and silver. Mesopotamia has mass production capacity and huge demand. So the Assyrians step into that gap. They ship textiles from the south and tin from farther east, likely coming from regions beyond Mesopotamia, and they bring those goods to Anatolia, where they exchange them for silver. And that silver flows back, not just as wealth, but as the fuel that keeps the trading engine going, paying partners, settling debts, reinvesting, financing the next caravan. It's capitalism in embryo, not because it's identical to modern capitalism, but because you see the same logic: credit networks, risk management, profit sharing, partnerships, and legal enforcement. These merchants weren't freelancing in chaos. They operated under a structured system. They had recognized measures and weights. They had written contracts that spelled out terms. They used seals. They testified in disputes. They had courts in the merchant community. And the clay tablets preserve it all, because that's how you make a far-flung network work. You document, you record, you prove. The archive from Kanesh is one of the richest windows we have into an ancient society that isn't just kings and temples. It's ordinary-ish people doing complicated things. And that matters for your lecture tone, because you can talk to an American audience in a way that's grounded. Look, these guys were not born as executioners. They were the ancient world's best accountants. Now, what did the network actually look like? Picture long caravans, donkeys, not camels yet, moving through rough terrain, crossing rivers, paying tolls, dealing with bandits, dealing with local rulers. This was risky business. Merchants didn't just get rich because they were clever, they got rich because they took on danger and managed it. They diversified shipments, they spread investments across partners, they used family members as agents in different cities. And the family part is huge. Old Assyrian trade is intensely family-based. You'll see husbands in Ashur writing to wives managing affairs at home, wives handling property, supervising servants, sometimes even dealing with textiles production and sending goods into the trade stream. You'll see brothers fighting over shares. You'll see sons being trained as apprentices in the Karum. You'll see the emotional side, anxiety about losses, frustration about partners who don't pay, anger at relatives who make dumb decisions, fear that the caravan is late because something went wrong. This is not the voice of a people who think only in terms of war. It's the voice of a people who think in terms of stability, reputation, and trust. Reputation is a currency in this world. If you're known as unreliable, you're done. And that's another theme you can keep in the back of your mind. Assyria later becomes famous for terror, but early Assyria survives on credibility. It's almost the opposite logic. Another thing that surprises people, the Assyrians didn't just show up in Anatolia and bully locals into buying their stuff. They integrated into existing political landscapes. They negotiated privileges. They paid taxes. They accepted the authority of local kings while maintaining internal community rules. That means they had diplomatic skill. They knew how to operate under someone else's sovereignty without losing their identity, and that's a subtle form of power. If you're looking for the seed of later imperial administration, it's here. They're practicing how to run a complex system across distance. They're practicing communication, record-keeping, enforcement, coordination. The empire later will do this with soldiers and governors. The trade network does it with letters and contracts. Same mental muscles, different tools. And because this is a lecture, let me give you a concrete way to describe it so it sticks. Imagine Ashur as a headquarters city, not a military headquarters yet, more like a commercial hub. From there, the Assyrians send out agents to multiple Anatolian towns. Kanesh is the big one, but not the only one. Goods flow out, silver flows back, information flows both ways. Prices, political news, disputes, marriages, deaths, everything. The Assyrians are building a kind of early intelligence network, not because they're spies, but because business demands information. If a local ruler is unstable, you need to know. If a road becomes dangerous, you need to know. If taxes increase, you need to know. And when you read these tablets, you realize the Assyrians are developing an instinct for the bigger picture, how events in one city affect outcomes in another. That's a proto-imperial worldview. It's not domination yet, it's systems thinking. Now, we should also be honest. Trade doesn't mean innocence. This isn't some peaceful utopia. Merchants can be ruthless. They can exploit. They can trap people in debt. They can fight dirty in court. They can ruin rivals. And the trade network sits inside a world where slavery exists, where inequality is normal, where violence is always a possibility. But the dominant Assyrian brand in this period is not terror. It's reliability and skill. They become famous because they can deliver. They can supply tin. They can supply textiles. They can make deals stick. That's why local partners work with them. That's why the colonies thrive. And the colonies are not just economic outposts, they are cultural bridges. Through them, ideas move, art styles, religious concepts, language influence, legal practice. So if later Assyria looks like it can plug different regions into one administrative machine, part of that ability comes from centuries of practicing cross-cultural interaction through trade. Here's where the story starts to darken, and it's important we transition without forcing it. Networks that depend on stability hate instability, and the old Assyrian trade system eventually gets disrupted, partly by shifts in Anatolian politics, partly by broader regional changes, and partly by the fact that big political players in Mesopotamia start fighting harder for control. When major states expand, they don't just conquer land, they mess with trade routes, toll regimes, security, and the legal environment that merchants rely on. It becomes harder to do business when the world is on fire. So the merchant era doesn't end because the Assyrians get bored of money and decide they want blood. It ends because the geopolitical environment that made the trade world possible starts to break down. And as that happens, Assyria has to adapt. A small city that survives by trade can't simply shrug when trade becomes risky or when neighbors become predatory. It has to find another strategy. Now, don't jump ahead too fast. We're not at the Neo-Assyrian war machine yet, but we're closer to the psychological pivot. Because think about what this period teaches an Assyrian elite. It teaches them that wealth is possible, but it's vulnerable. It teaches them that distance can be managed, but only with organization. It teaches them that outsiders can be partners, but they can also become threats overnight. And it teaches them that if you're operating in someone else's political space, you are ultimately exposed to their decisions. Your prosperity can be ended by a king you didn't elect and can't control. So a society that becomes rich through trade is going to develop a very sharp sense of risk. And risk over time can turn into fear. Fear can turn into the desire for control. And the desire for control is one of the emotional engines behind empire. So here's the moment where the mood changes, and it's not subtle. If the old Assyrian period feels like spreadsheets and caravan routes and family letters, this chapter is where the world reminds Ashur that commerce doesn't protect you from geopolitics. You can be the smartest merchant on the road and still get crushed because two kings you've never met decide to redraw the map. And I'm going to call it humiliation on purpose, because that's what it becomes in the collective memory. Not just a loss, but a feeling that the world is laughing at you, that you're surrounded, that you can't trust anybody, that your prosperity is basically rented, not owned. This is where the trauma piece starts to make sense. Now, the first name people recognize is Hammurabi, because the Code of Hammurabi is one of those ancient world greatest hits. But the code is only part of the story. Hammurabi is also a political operator, a builder, and frankly, a shark. Babylon before him is not yet the unstoppable legend. It's a city-state in a crowded neighborhood. Hammurabi turns it into a dominant power in southern Mesopotamia by doing what the best rulers in this region always do. He plays rivals against each other. He picks timing carefully. He uses alliances until he doesn't need them anymore. And he understands that wars are won as much with diplomacy and logistics as with spears. And this is exactly the kind of leader who creates problems for a place like Ashur, because Assyria at this stage isn't a giant empire, it's a regional state with ambitions and vulnerabilities, and it's operating in a world where bigger players are learning how to consolidate. Now let's connect this to the earlier Assyrian figure we mentioned, Hamshi-Adad first. He's a big deal because he's one of the first people to build something like a broader northern Mesopotamian kingdom that includes Assyria as a core. He expands, he builds administrative control, he makes alliances, and for a moment it looks like Assyria might break out early. But here's the harsh rule of this era. States that are held together by one strong personality tend to wobble the second that personality is gone. Hamshi-Adad's system doesn't long outlive him. His successors can't hold the same web of power. Local elites shift, cities defect, rivals pounce. And right around this time, in the south, Hammurabi is ascending, dealing with his own rivals, Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, basically clearing the board one opponent at a time. There's a scene you can almost picture. Northern Mesopotamia is unstable after Hamshi-Adad, and Hammurabi is watching, calculating, taking advantage, not necessarily out of personal hatred for Assyria, but because that's what power does in this region. It expands to fill space. And when you read the history from the Assyrian side, what it feels like is getting outmaneuvered, not just beaten in battle, but outplayed. Your alliances don't hold, your neighbors switch sides, you can't rely on anyone. And in a culture that values status, that stings. But the deeper humiliation comes next, because the real yoke in this chapter title isn't Babylon, it's Mitanni. Mitanni is one of those names that isn't famous outside history circles, but for Assyria, it's a nightmare. We're talking about a powerful state that rises in the region of northern Mesopotamia and Syria in the mid-2nd millennium BCE. They're strategically positioned. They have access to high-quality horse culture and chariot warfare traditions, and they build a network of influence that reaches across the same zone Assyria needs to breathe. And at some point, Assyria becomes effectively a subordinate, pressured, constrained, sometimes outright a vassal. And if you're wondering why this matters emotionally, not just politically, it's because vassal status is not just pay some tribute and move on. It's a daily reminder that you are not the author of your own fate. Your king has to defer, your diplomacy is limited, your economy gets taxed and controlled, your pride gets bruised. And to make it worse, the Assyrians aren't clueless villagers who don't know what real power looks like. They've seen powerful civilizations, they're literate, they have history, they know the stories of Akkad and Ur. They know what greatness is supposed to feel like. So being forced to bow hurts when you can imagine standing upright. This is where that surrounded by enemies mentality starts to become rational, not paranoid. If you're Assyria in this period, you're not living in a stable international order. You're living in a neighborhood where stronger states can and will turn you into a client. It's easy for us to say, from the outside, well, just be peaceful, just be nice. Peace doesn't save you if someone else decides you're useful as a buffer state or a tax base. So what does a society learn from that? It learns that trade is great until someone blocks the route. It learns that diplomacy is great until the alliance collapses. It learns that law and contracts are great until the king with chariots shows up and says, "New rules." And the lesson becomes, if we ever get the chance to control the environment instead of being controlled by it, we should take it. That's the seed of later Assyrian expansionism, not because they're uniquely evil, but because their earlier experience teaches them that vulnerability is intolerable. Now, I want to pause and make sure we're not oversimplifying. Assyria wasn't a helpless punching bag for centuries. There are periods of autonomy, local strength, regional influence. The point is that the overall trend is insecurity. Even when they're independent, the independence is fragile. It can be revoked by a stronger neighbor. And the more often that happens, the more it shapes political culture. Think about what kind of leaders get rewarded in that environment. Probably not the ones who say, let's take a long view and avoid conflict. The ones who survive are the ones who can mobilize fast, punish threats, keep elites in line, and project strength outward. And that's how the political DNA starts to drift toward militarization. It's not a light switch, but you can see the direction. And you can also see how Babylon fits into this psychological story as more than a rival. Babylon becomes a symbol of something Assyria both wants and resents: prestige, cultural authority, the feeling of being the center of the world. Babylon has that aura. Even when it's politically weak, it's culturally heavyweight. Assyria will later struggle with this constantly. Do you respect Babylon because it's ancient and prestigious, or do you destroy it because it's a perpetual source of rebellion and humiliation? That dilemma doesn't appear out of thin air in the Neo-Assyrian period. It's rooted in this long earlier relationship where Babylon can outplay you, where Babylon can claim to be the rightful center, where Babylon's kings can make your kings look small. You start to understand why later Assyrian kings sometimes act almost obsessively when Babylon is involved. It's not just strategy, it's identity. Okay, so how does this chapter end? It ends with the slow emergence of a new Assyrian posture, not merely surviving, but planning to never be trapped again. That plan takes a long time. It requires institutional change. It requires military reforms. It requires a state that can raise, supply, and discipline forces reliably. It requires a leadership ideology that can justify constant campaigning. And it requires a public that can be convinced, through religion, propaganda, and fear, that expansion is not optional, but necessary. But at the emotional core of it, there's a simple scar. We were humiliated. We were made dependent. We were surrounded. We will not let that happen again. And next, we're going to watch how Assyria turns that scar into a system. Because once Assyria regains independence in a real durable way, once it starts building a harder, more militarized state, then the story shifts from the underdog gets pushed around to the underdog learns how to bite, and eventually to the underdog becomes the thing everyone else fears. By the time we hit what historians call the Middle Assyrian period, you can feel the Assyrian state changing shape. It's like watching someone who used to survive by being clever and flexible slowly decide, no, from now on we survive by being hard. Not cruel for fun, hard as a policy, hard as a reflex. And you can see why. If your last few centuries taught you that you can be humiliated, boxed in, turned into a vassal, and forced to watch your neighbors write your future, you start building institutions that don't depend on luck. You start building a state that can fight routinely, not occasionally. You start building a state that can endure long wars and bad years. That is what Middle Assyria is, the workshop where Assyria's later imperial machine gets hammered into something durable. This is where militarism stops being a temporary response and becomes part of the state's identity. And then, because history loves irony, right when Assyria is forging itself into a tougher power, the entire international system of the Late Bronze Age begins to crack and then collapse. The famous Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is one of those periods where historians still argue over causes because there isn't one neat explanation. It's probably a pile-up: drought and climate stress in some regions, earthquakes in others, internal rebellions, economic strain, disruption of trade routes, and waves of migration and raiding. The so-called sea peoples on the Mediterranean side are part of the story, but not the whole story. The result, though, is clearer than the causes. Major powers that looked permanent suddenly break. The Hittite Empire collapses. Mycenaean palace culture in Greece disappears. Egypt survives, but declines and retreats from its old imperial reach. Cities burn, networks fail, diplomatic correspondence stops. It's like the lights go out across the eastern Mediterranean and parts of the Near East. And in that darkness, Assyria does something that becomes central to its legend. It doesn't die. It staggers, it struggles, but it stays standing. That survival becomes a kind of proof internally that their way works, that discipline and organization can outlast chaos. But let's not jump straight to 1200 BCE yet. First, we have to understand what Middle Assyria actually does differently. The short version is Assyria becomes more territorial, more bureaucratic, more coercive. Earlier, in the merchant era, you have networks. Now you start getting something like a state that thinks in provinces, borders, and control. Assyrian kings begin to campaign more regularly and record those campaigns in a way that isn't just bragging, it's political messaging. They're telling elites, rivals, and their own people, the king is active, The king protects, the king punishes, the king expands. This is also when you see legal and administrative standardization tightening. The state is reaching deeper into society, controlling labor and obligations. This is not some modern, total state, but compared to earlier periods, the direction is unmistakable. The Assyrian state is learning how to extract resources reliably, and that's the backbone of military power. You can't run armies on vibes. You need grain, you need weapons, you need animals, you need transport, you need supply systems that don't collapse the first time a campaign runs longer than planned. Middle Assyria is where those systems become part of the state, not just improvisation. There are a few kings in this period who matter, and you don't have to memorize them like a quiz, but it helps to know the arc. Assyria pushes against neighbors, especially in the north and west, and begins to assert itself as more than a local player. In particular, as Mitanni weakens, because nothing lasts forever, Assyria gets its opening. This is the moment the old humiliation begins to reverse. The empire that once pressed Assyria now loses its grip, and Assyria moves into spaces that used to be denied to it. That isn't just revenge, it's strategic breathing room. It's the state saying, we are not going back into that box. And once you take territory, you have a new problem. How do you hold it? That's where you start seeing the early versions of policies that will later be infamous: moving populations, installing Assyrian officials, extracting tribute systematically, turning conquered zones into something that can be governed and exploited rather than merely raided. This is also when the Assyrians start sharpening their identity around the god Ashur in a new way. Ashur is not just the city's protector. Ashur becomes the divine sponsor of the king's order. Expansion starts to look like cosmic duty. Again, it's not yet the full Neo-Assyrian ideology that says, if we stop conquering, the universe collapses, but you can see how easy that leap will be later. Once your legitimacy is tied to success in war, war becomes hard to stop.
Now, let's talk about the Bronze Age collapse, because people often misunderstand it as a single wave of destruction that hits everywhere equally. It's not that clean. It's more like a long, uneven crisis that knocks out interconnected systems. The late Bronze Age world is highly networked for its time. There's international diplomacy, royal marriages, gift exchanges, formal treaties. There's long-distance trade, copper, tin, luxury goods. There are palace economies that depend on centralized storage and redistribution. When those networks get stressed by drought, by war, by rebellions, collapse can cascade. If you can't get tin, you can't make bronze. If you can't maintain your armies, you can't defend your palaces. If your palaces fall, the administrative system collapses. If the administrative system collapses, you can't collect taxes. If you can't collect taxes, you can't rebuild. It's a chain reaction. The Sea Peoples concept is often used as a catch-all villain, but even in ancient sources, it looks more like a symptom than a sole cause. Groups on the move, raiding and settling, taking advantage of weakened states. They're part of a broader pattern of instability. So why does Assyria survive when so many others fall? There isn't one magic answer, but there are a few strong factors that fit with our story. First, geography. Assyria is not a Mediterranean palace economy like the Mycenaeans. It's inland, more centered on river valleys and overland routes. It's still affected by trade disruptions, but it's not entirely dependent on sea-based networks that collapse dramatically. Second, institutional toughness.
By this time, Assyria has been building a militarized state structure for centuries. It has routines of campaigning, extraction, and control. That matters when everything else is improvising. Third, political culture. A society trained by repeated insecurity tends to default toward discipline rather than complacency. And fourth, luck. Because luck is always part of survival, and any honest historian admits that. But what's interesting is what Assyria does with that survival psychologically. Surviving the collapse doesn't make them humble, it makes them confident. It feels like validation, like everyone else was soft, we were strong. Everyone else relied on fragile networks, we relied on ourselves. Everyone else crumbled, we held. That kind of lesson can become dangerous because it teaches a state that its harshness is not a problem, but a virtue. It teaches leaders that fear and discipline are not just tools, but the correct way to run the world. And now look at the map after the collapse. There's a vacuum. The Hittites are gone. Egypt is less present in Syria and Canaan than before. Many cities are weakened. New groups and smaller kingdoms rise, but the old superpowers that kept the system stable are diminished. In that environment, an organized, aggressive state like Assyria has an opportunity that earlier generations could only dream of. It can expand into zones that are fragmented and defenseless. It can demand tribute from newly vulnerable polities. It can position itself as the new center of order enforced by war. But we should be clear, Middle Assyria isn't yet the Neo-Assyrian steamroller. There are still setbacks. There are still periods where Assyria contracts, struggles, loses territory, faces internal issues. There are years when kings are weak, when the state turns inward, when neighbors push back. The point is the long-term direction. Through the Middle Assyrian period and into the early Iron Age, Assyria is learning how to be a war state that can operate year after year. The repeated cycles of campaigning and control are becoming normal, and that normalization is maybe the most important change of all. Once a state's economy, elite status, religious legitimacy, and political culture are aligned around expansion, expansion becomes self-perpetuating. It starts to feel like if you stop, you die. That is the mindset that will fully bloom under the Neo-Assyrian kings. All right, now we hit the part of the Assyrian story that people think is the whole story. This is where the empire starts to look like the Assyria from nightmares, the Assyria from those carved palace walls where kings pose like action heroes and captives are stacked like trophies. And the king who really announces that new era with zero subtlety is Ashurnasirpal II. If Assyria spent the previous chapters learning how to survive and how to build a war-capable state, Ashurnasirpal is where it becomes a performance, a brand, an ideology, and, this is the uncomfortable word, an engine. The reason he matters isn't only that he fights a lot. Plenty of ancient kings fight a lot. The reason he matters is that he turns conquest into something sacred and systematic, and he pairs it with a deliberate policy of terror that's designed to make future fighting easier. That is the key. It's not random cruelty, it's calculated cruelty. The Assyrians under Ashurnasirpal start treating fear the way modern states treat deterrence. You frighten people so thoroughly that they don't want to test you, and if they do test you, the punishment is staged so publicly that everyone else gets the message. Now, before we go into the horror, I want to anchor you in what's happening structurally, because otherwise it just becomes gore. By the early Neo-Assyrian period, Assyria is positioned to expand. It has a hardened military culture, it has organizational continuity, and the regional environment is fragmented enough that a disciplined aggressor can win repeatedly. But winning battles isn't the same as building an empire. An empire, in the Assyrian sense, is a system where you can campaign almost every year, extract tribute, control routes, and punish rebellion so consistently that the entire region starts to behave as if Assyria is the weather. Like, you don't negotiate with the weather, you prepare for it, you fear it, you adjust your life around it. Ashurnasirpal is one of the first kings who gets that, and then commits to it as a lifestyle. He also does something else that's easy to miss. He relocates and rebuilds the imperial center in a very loud way. He makes Kalhu, Nimrud, into a major capital, and he builds it like a statement. Huge palace, massive reliefs, inscriptions everywhere, art that screams power. And that's not just vanity, it's administration and propaganda fused. The palace is a headquarters, it's a warehouse of records, it's the stage where foreign envoys are intimidated before they even speak. It's the place where the king's version of reality becomes the official version, carved into stone so it can outlast him. And those inscriptions matter because they show you the ideology. The Neo-Assyrian state doesn't justify war the way a modern state might: national security, resources, defense treaties, whatever. It justifies war cosmically. The god Ashur commands expansion. The king is the agent of Ashur. The king doesn't just rule a territory, he maintains order in the universe. That sounds dramatic, and it is dramatic, but it's also extremely practical, because it makes conquest not merely something the king wants, but something the world requires. If you're an Assyrian elite listening to this ideology, you're not just supporting policy, you're supporting the stability of creation. And if you're a subject population hearing it, you're not just resisting a human king, you're resisting the divine order he claims to represent. This is the moment where the Assyrian Empire starts to become self-justifying. Success in war proves divine favor. Divine favor justifies more war. More war produces more success, and so on. It's a loop. And that loop is dangerous because it makes stopping feel like failure, even if stopping would be wise. Now, what does Ashurnasirpal actually do on the ground? He campaigns aggressively to secure Assyria's borders and expand influence westward and northward into the zones that matter economically and strategically: trade routes, timber supplies, metals, access to the Mediterranean corridor, the whole "how do we stop being landlocked and boxed in" problem. He demands tribute from cities and kingdoms. He installs Assyrian authority. He crushes rebellion, and crucially, he advertises the crushing. If you've ever wondered why Assyrian kings brag about brutality in their own inscriptions, why put that in writing, this is the reason. It's messaging. He's telling you, and he's telling everyone else, that resistance is not heroic, it's suicidal. And he wants that message to travel faster than his army, because if fear travels ahead of the troops, cities surrender without a fight, and that saves Assyrian lives and resources. That's the cold logic. This is what I mean by calculated terror. It's a strategy to reduce the cost of occupation by raising the cost of rebellion to a level that feels unbearable. It's also, to be blunt, a way to compensate for the fact that even a strong empire can't garrison everywhere with infinite soldiers. Terror is a force multiplier. You don't need an army on every corner if the story of what happens to rebels is known everywhere. That's why the cruelty is public, ritualized, and described in detail. I'm not going to linger on the graphic parts for entertainment. This is a lecture, not a true crime podcast. But we do have to acknowledge what the sources say. Punishments that include mass executions, mutilations, displays of bodies, and other methods meant to shock. And there's another layer to this. It's not only fear, it's humiliation. It's the reversal of what Assyria experienced earlier, under Ashurnasirpal. That trauma becomes projection. The empire is saying to others, you will feel powerless the way we once felt powerless. You will be reminded daily that your fate is in someone else's hands. That's not a scientific claim about psychology, but it's a pretty reasonable way to understand the emotional tone of the imperial messaging. It's not just practical intimidation, it's dominance as identity repair. Now, if we stop here, it can sound like Assyria is just a terror machine. But the truth is, terror is only one side of it. The other side is administration, boring, effective, relentless. Ashurnasirpal and his successors are building a system of tribute and control that requires record-keeping, standardized demands, organized logistics, and dependable communication. The terror opens the door, the bureaucracy keeps it open. That's the real Assyrian invention as an empire, the combination. Plenty of states can be brutal for a season. Assyria becomes brutal and organized at the same time, which means it can keep going. And that's why historians keep coming back to Assyria when they talk about the first true empire. Not because no one conquered before, but because Assyria turns conquest into routine governance. It's also why so many later empires study them, even if they never admit it. Now, let me put a human face on how this might have felt for people outside Assyria. Imagine you're a local king in Syria or in the Levant, hearing reports, Assyria is coming. You've heard about what happened to the last city that resisted. You've seen the tribute lists. You know what surrender requires: hostages, payments, maybe troops, maybe the removal of your autonomy. But you also know what rebellion risks: the destruction of your city and your dynasty. So you're trapped. And in that trap, surrender becomes the rational choice, even if it tastes like ash. That's why the terror works. It turns resistance into a gamble where the odds are terrifying. So in a weird way, terror is used to produce stability. Stability defined as obedience. And once you have that obedience, you can extract wealth, build palaces, fund more campaigns, and make the state stronger, which makes the fear more credible, which makes the next round of obedience easier. Again, the loop. Now, we should also say clearly, these inscriptions are propaganda. They're royal self-portraits. Ashurnasirpal wants to appear unstoppable. He wants to appear merciless. He wants his enemies to think surrender is the only sane option. That means he has an incentive to exaggerate, to choose stories that maximize fear, to frame himself as a divine instrument. So when we read these texts, we don't treat them like neutral reporting. But even if you discount some of the boasting, the pattern is unmistakable. Terror is part of policy, not an accident. Let me switch the lighting for a second. Because if we stay in the Ashurnasirpal mood too long, the whole story turns into one long scream, and that's not actually what the record shows. This next chapter is where Assyria gets two very different kinds of power in the spotlight. First, a woman whose real life gets swallowed by legend, and then a king who basically rewires the state. And together, they show something important. Assyria isn't just a war machine with one setting. It's a political organism that can improvise, consolidate, reform, and even mythologize itself in ways that later generations barely recognize. Let's start with Semiramis, because most people know that name even if they don't know why. In later Greek and Roman storytelling, Semiramis becomes this larger-than-life queen, builder of cities, conqueror, seductive mastermind, sometimes credited with wonders like the Hanging Gardens. She's basically ancient celebrity fiction. But when you scrape off the myth, you find a real person underneath, Shammaramat, an Assyrian queen who lived in the 9th century BCE and acted as regent for her young son, Adad-nirari III. Here's why that matters. Assyrian political culture is not exactly famous for giving women public power. Royal women existed, obviously, and they could be influential behind the scenes, but visible authority at the top is rare. Shammaramat stands out because she appears in inscriptions and later memory as someone who held the center when the center could have snapped. A regency is one of the most dangerous moments in any monarchy. People test the throne, elites whisper, rivals make their move, provinces look at the capital and think, are they weak right now? If you want to see how empires collapse, you often start with succession crises. So the fact that Shammaramat's regency becomes remembered at all suggests she did more than just sit there and wave. She maintained continuity. She held the apparatus together. And that's a kind of power that doesn't look heroic on a relief panel, but it's the power that keeps an empire alive. Now, it's important not to oversell it. We don't have a diary from Shammaramat saying, here's my policy platform. What we have are hints, titles, later traditions, and the fact of stability. But in a lecture, that's enough to make the point. Assyria's story includes political adaptability and unusual figures, not just kings and helmets. And that's why the myth takes off later. Cultures often mythologize the rare exceptions. A powerful queen becomes a canvas for every fantasy, sexual, political, architectural. Semiramis becomes the idea of female power projected backward, and she becomes famous partly because she's so unusual in the record. So in the narrative of your talk, she's a useful pause, a reminder that the empire is also held together by people who aren't on the battlefield. And now, once we've cleared that, we get to the big structural star of this chapter, Tiglath-Pileser III. If Ashurnasirpal II is the king who makes terror a language of expansion, Tiglath-Pileser III is the guy who makes the empire run like a system that can occupy and administer territory permanently. He's not just raiding and extracting tribute, he's building a model where Assyria takes land, restructures it, and keeps it. And a lot of historians treat his reign as one of the decisive turning points that turns the Neo-Assyrian kingdom into the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the full, mature sense. Here's the situation he inherits. Assyria has already been strong, but strength in the ancient world is often cyclical. Kings are strong, then weaker successors lose control. Powerful officials become semi-independent. Provinces drift. Enemies probe the borders, and suddenly the empire looks less like a machine and more like a patchwork held together by fear and habit. Tiglath-Pileser III steps in and says, essentially, no more patchwork. His reforms are about breaking the ability of local elites, both Assyrian and conquered, to become independent power centers. He wants the king's authority to be direct, standardized, and repeatable across the map. And this is where we need to talk about the army, because Tiglath-Pileser III is often credited with creating something like the first professional standing army in the ancient Near East, at least in a form that looks recognizably state-run and permanent rather than seasonal. Earlier states could mobilize big forces, sure, but often they were temporary levies, farmers called up for a campaign season, then sent back to the fields. That limits what you can do. If you need a harvest, you can't keep men away forever. If your army melts back into civilian life every year, you lose training continuity, you lose discipline, You lose the ability to campaign in multiple seasons or in distant regions reliably. Tiglath-Pileser moves toward an army that is more permanent, more specialized, and more centrally controlled. He uses a mix of Assyrian core troops and incorporated forces from conquered peoples. He standardizes units, he improves logistics, and he makes the army not just a tool of conquest, but an instrument of governance. Because if you can station forces, rotate them, supply them, and keep them loyal, you can hold territory in a way that earlier kings struggled to do. But the army is only half the story. The other half is administration. Tiglath-Pileser reorganizes conquered areas into provinces governed by Assyrian officials rather than leaving local kings in place as semi-independent vassals. This is huge. Vassal kings are useful in the short term. They collect tribute for you, they manage local politics, they give you plausible deniability, but they're also a constant rebellion risk. A vassal king has his own dynasty, his own legitimacy, his own pride. He can flip sides, he can stop paying, he can rally his people with a simple message, "We used to be free." Tiglath-Pileser's solution is to remove that middle layer whenever possible. Instead of a web of client states, you get a map of provinces integrated into Assyria's system. That is what occupation looks like. And once you occupy, you need a bureaucracy that can measure and manage. Tax assessments, labor obligations, land records, tribute flows, military levies, and intelligence reporting. This is where the empire becomes something more than terror. It becomes governance on a massive scale. Now here comes the thing that makes Tiglath-Pileser's system both effective and horrifying. He's one of the kings who uses mass deportation not as an occasional punishment, but as a standard tool of statecraft. We're going to devote a whole chapter to deportations, so I won't steal that thunder yet. But the key idea starts here. If you want to prevent rebellion, you don't just punish rebels. You rearrange populations. You break local identity by removing people from the land that gives them cohesion. You move skilled workers where you need them. You repopulate strategic areas with groups who have no local roots and therefore fewer reasons to rebel. This is social engineering at an imperial scale. And it sounds cold because it is cold, but in the logic of empire, it's extremely rational. It turns ethnic and political identity into something the state can manipulate. Another reform that often gets overlooked but matters a lot is information. The Neo-Assyrian Empire becomes famous for intelligence, reports from governors, messengers moving constantly, scouts, scribes recording everything. Tiglath-Pileser's system thrives on knowing what's happening everywhere. You can't run a large empire if you learn about a rebellion 6 months late. So communication networks, the reliability of couriers, the standardization of reporting, this becomes part of Assyria's edge. You start to see the outline of something later empires will copy. A central authority receiving a constant stream of data, then responding quickly with force or policy. It's not modern bureaucracy, but it's closer to it than most people expect from the ancient world. Now, where does Semiramis fit into this, besides the fact that she's interesting? She fits because she's a reminder that imperial continuity isn't just about battles, it's about transitions. A regent stabilizes a moment of vulnerability. A reformer then uses stability to restructure the system. Assyria survives its fragile moments, and because it survives, it gets the chance to evolve. And Tiglath-Pileser's evolution is what makes the later peak possible. The Sargonid dynasty, the conquest of huge territories, the ability to fight on multiple fronts, the confidence to take on Egypt. None of that happens if the state is still running on a loose patchwork model. Tiglath-Pileser turns it into a centralized imperial platform. And I want to highlight something that's going to be important later when we talk about Assyria's collapse. Reforms that create efficiency also create dependence. When everything runs through the center becomes a single point of failure. When you make the empire a machine, it works great until it breaks. But for now, in the 8th century BCE, it's working, and it's terrifyingly impressive. The Assyrian Empire is no longer just a kingdom that raids and punishes. It's an occupation empire, with provinces, governors, a more professional army, forced population transfers, and a belief system that frames expansion as destiny. Here's the policy that made Assyria infamous in a way that even their enemies couldn't ignore. Moving people on purpose, at scale, as a tool of government. Not a side effect of war, not a one-off punishment, but a repeatable method, like taxes, like provinces, like road building. If you want to understand why Assyria feels so modern sometimes, in the worst way, it's right here. Because deportation in the Neo-Assyrian world is basically social engineering with soldiers. You take a population that has a strong local identity, strong local elites, strong local religion tied to a place, and you break the connection between people and land. And you do it to prevent rebellion, to control labor, to reorganize the empire like it's a living map you can redraw. That's the intention. That's the logic. And it's also, obviously, a human catastrophe for the people being moved. The hardest thing is holding both truths at once. Deportations were brutally effective as statecraft, and they were devastating to real human lives. So why did the Assyrians do it? Let's start with the simplest reason. Rebellion was constant. If you're running an empire made of dozens of peoples and cities, somebody is always thinking about resisting. Sometimes it's ideological. We were free once. Sometimes it's economic. Tribute is heavy, governors are corrupt, famine hits, and people blame the empire. Sometimes it's just opportunistic. Your king died. We think you're weak. Let's try. For Assyria, rebellion is not an exception, it's the background noise of empire. And if you respond to every rebellion by fighting a full war, you burn out. It's expensive. Soldiers die. Logistics strain. You can't be everywhere. So the Assyrians develop a menu of responses. Punishments for leaders, tribute increases, installing a new ruler, turning a vassal kingdom into a province, and then, when they want a deeper fix, deportation. The idea is remove the people most capable of organizing resistance and dilute the rest by mixing them with other groups. If you're uprooted and dropped into a new place where your neighbors speak different languages and have different customs, it's harder to coordinate rebellion. You've lost your local network. Your sacred geography is gone. Your political memory still exists, but it's weakened. And from the Assyrian perspective, that's the point. There's also a labor side. The Assyrians didn't deport people just to hurt them. They deported people because empires need workers. Big building projects need labor. Agriculture in underpopulated areas needs farmers. Craft production needs skilled artisans. Armies need support. If you move populations around, you can repopulate regions that were depopulated by war. You can bring skilled specialists to your capitals. You can strengthen weak provinces. In other words, deportation isn't only punishment, it's resource management. It's the empire treating human beings as movable assets. And if that sentence makes you uncomfortable, good, it should. because that's exactly the kind of thinking that makes an empire powerful and frightening. Now, what did deportation actually look like? It wasn't always one image of chained crowds in a straight line, even though Assyrian art loves that image. Sometimes it was violent and sudden. Cities fall, leaders executed, families dragged out. Sometimes it was more bureaucratic, census-style listings, organized transport, resettlement plans. The state could be meticulous. People might be marched or transported by boat, depending on geography. They were often moved in family groups, which tells you something important. The Assyrians wanted productive communities, not just prisoners. If you deport only men, you get short-term labor and long-term collapse. If you move families, you can plant them somewhere and get sustained output. That doesn't make it humane, it makes it strategic. And yes, people died on the way. Disease, exhaustion, hunger, exposure. Every forced migration has that reality. But the imperial aim was not to exterminate, it was to relocate and repurpose. That distinction matters, especially because modern audiences sometimes hear deportation and think genocide. The Assyrian program is closer to what we'd call forced resettlement and population transfer. Still horrific, still violent, still traumatic, but designed to keep people alive as taxpayers and workers. This is where the term state engineering really fits. Okay, now we have to talk about the most famous case for an American audience because it connects to the Bible, the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel and the so-called lost tribes. The basic story is that Assyria expands into the Levant over the 8th century BCE. Israel, the northern kingdom, gets caught in that imperial orbit, pays tribute at times, rebels at times, and eventually Assyria takes Samaria, the capital, in the late 720s BCE. In the traditional timeline, you'll often hear 722 BCE as a key date, and whether you pin it to that exact year or treat it as a short campaign window, the result is the same. The Assyrian state ends the northern kingdom as an independent political unit. And then, crucially, the Assyrians deport a portion of the population and resettle other groups into the area. This is where lost tribes comes from. The idea that the deported Israelites disappear into the broader imperial world, absorbed into other populations, leaving a historical mystery and a religious trauma that echoes for centuries. Now, if we're being careful, and we should be, most scholars would tell you it's unlikely that literally everyone was removed. Empires often deport elites, administrators, military-age people, skilled workers, people who matter for organization, more than they deport every single farmer. But even partial deportation can shatter a society, because removing leadership and scattering communities breaks continuity. And when you also import other groups into the region, you change its demographic and cultural mix. That's why later texts talk about new populations in Samaria and why the memory becomes so charged. From the Assyrian point of view, it's a textbook solution. Remove a rebellious center, strip it of its leadership, repopulate it with people who don't share the same local nationalist story, and turn the region into a manageable province. From the human point of view, it's loss. Land, identity, graves, temples, community structure, the feeling of being at home in the world. This is why Assyria becomes a symbol of oppression in biblical memory, not just because they were violent, but because they were systematic. They didn't just defeat you, they rearranged your life. Now zoom out again, because this isn't only about Israel. The deportation policy is used across the empire again and again. Arameans, Babylonians, people from the Zagros, from Syria, from the Levant, many different groups are moved. And over time, this produces an imperial population that is mixed in a way earlier states rarely managed. Cities inside Assyria become multi-ethnic. Workforces include people with different languages and crafts. The empire becomes, in a strange sense, more integrated, not because it's tolerant in a modern moral sense, but because it's forcibly blended. You can almost see the imperial dream, a world where local identities are weaker and loyalty is directed upward to the Assyrian king and to the imperial system. And sometimes, practically, that blending could work. Deportees weren't always treated as disposable. In many cases, they were settled, given land or assigned work, and incorporated into the economy. Some could rise within the system. Over generations, people adapted. Life continued. Which is exactly why the policy is so effective. It doesn't just punish, it transforms. It converts conquered populations into a resource base for the empire. But effectiveness doesn't erase suffering. There's a deep cruelty baked into it. The state deciding your identity is a problem, and the solution is to scatter you like seeds. There's also a political side inside Assyria. Deportations don't only control outsiders, they help control Assyrian elites too. Because every time the empire expands, the king has to worry not only about foreign rebels, but about powerful Assyrian officials who might turn provinces into personal kingdoms. When you constantly move populations and reorganize provinces, you make it harder for any one governor to build a stable local base. The king stays the center, the empire stays fluid. That's another reason deportation becomes routine. It's a way to keep the whole system from ossifying into rival power centers. So, weirdly, deportation is both an external weapon and an internal management tool. It's the empire disciplining everyone at once. Now, what are the long-term consequences? On the one hand, deportations help Assyria last as long as it does. They reduce the frequency of some rebellions and allow the empire to exploit labor and skills efficiently. They help build Assyria's massive cities and projects. They contribute to a kind of imperial cosmopolitanism, forced but real. On the other hand, deportations also create a reservoir of hatred. People don't forget being uprooted. Even if their grandchildren adapt, the memory can survive in stories, in religious texts, in identity narratives. And for regions like Babylon, where cultural prestige is enormous and local identity is stubborn, brutal policies can backfire. If you treat a prestigious city like a rebellious province, you don't just create a security problem, you create a moral enemy that never stops resisting you. That will matter later. Another consequence is practical. Moving large populations is expensive and complex. It requires logistics, guards, food, planning. It ties the empire's stability to its ability to manage human movement. It's one more system that has to keep functioning. And as the empire grows, every system becomes a strain point. Also, mixing populations can sometimes create instability of its own. New groups don't always integrate smoothly. Imported communities may resent where they're placed. Local populations may resent newcomers. The empire can manage that while it's strong. When it's weak, those tensions can explode. So, deportation is a tool that works best when the empire is already powerful. It is not a cure for imperial weakness, it's a multiplier of imperial strength. And that brings us right up to the edge of the peak period, because by the time we reach the great kings of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Assyria has mastered this kind of rule, not just defeating enemies, but restructuring societies. The result is a superpower that feels almost unstoppable, militarily, administratively, and psychologically. But superpowers always carry the seeds of their own limits, and one of those limits is that ruling through fear and forced movement can hold an empire together until the moment it doesn't.
Picture the Assyrian Empire at its height, like a giant machine made of roads, messengers, garrisons, scribes, and fear. Something that can reach from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, and, for a moment, even dip its hand into Egypt. This is the era of the Sargonids, and it's where Assyria looks the most like what we'd recognize as a superpower, not just a big, aggressive kingdom. The cast is basically 4 rulers who feel like a dynasty built for legend: Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal. And what's wild is that with them you get this constant double image. On one side, the most terrifying imperial violence in the region's memory, and on the other, an obsession with knowledge, archives, literature, and the idea that order is something you can write down, catalog, and preserve. That tension is the heart of this chapter, because it's the easiest way to break the cartoon version of Assyria. It's not just they were brutal, it's they were brutally organized, and also deeply intellectual in a very elite, state-serving way. Let's start with Sargon II, because even his name is a statement. He's reaching back to Sargon of Akkad, basically borrowing the prestige of the first big conqueror in Mesopotamian memory, like he's saying, yes, that legacy, that's mine now. Sargon II's rise also isn't the cleanest story. There are reasons historians talk about him as a usurper, or at least a ruler who had to prove legitimacy fast. So he does what ambitious Assyrian kings do. He campaigns relentlessly, he wins loudly, and he builds. He creates a new capital, Dur-Sharukin, which is one of those ancient moves that screams, new era, new center, this is my world now. And even though that city doesn't stay the primary capital for long, the act itself shows you something. Assyria, at this stage, has the resources to just build a capital like it's a project plan. That's peak empire behavior. Under Sargon II, the empire consolidates control over a ton of territory, and it tightens the provincial system and tribute extraction that earlier kings like Tiglath-Pileser III pushed forward.
Then comes Sennacherib, and if Sargon II is the consolidator builder, Sennacherib is the king whose reign becomes a case study in both imperial power and imperial rage. He's famous in the West partly because of his campaigns in the Levant, especially the drama around Judah and Jerusalem under King Hezekiah. But inside the Assyrian story, his most explosive relationship is with Babylon. Babylon is the empire's permanent headache, culturally prestigious, politically rebellious, and emotionally loaded for Assyrian kings who both crave Babylonian legitimacy and despise Babylonian defiance. Sennacherib's approach is basically, fine, you want to rebel endlessly, I'm going to erase the problem. And he does the thing that shocks even by Assyrian standards. He destroys Babylon in 689 BCE, and he advertises it, because that's what Assyrian kings do. They turn policy into theater. The destruction isn't just military, it's symbolic, like smashing the rival's aura. But here's where the empire's contradictions show. Babylon is too important to simply delete from history. You can destroy it physically, but you don't kill its prestige, and you don't kill the geopolitical necessity of controlling the South. So Sennacherib's solution is also a problem handed to his successors. Meanwhile, Sennacherib does something else that shows you what a peak empire invests in. Infrastructure and showmanship fuse together. He turns Nineveh into a capital that feels like an imperial statement in stone and water, massive building projects, canals, gardens, walls, palaces. Again, not just vanity, but administration, storage, ritual, intimidation, all in one place. The capital is where you make the empire feel inevitable. Foreign envoys come in, and the message is, you're not dealing with a local king, you're dealing with the center of the world. Then we get Esarhaddon. And Esarhaddon is interesting because he represents a corrective turn, especially with Babylon. After Sennacherib's destruction, Esarhaddon rebuilds Babylon. And this is one of the best examples of Assyria's complexity. The same empire that can annihilate a city can also decide politically, okay, we need that city functional. We need its priests on side. We need its cultural legitimacy. We need stability in the south, and then pour resources into rebuilding it. That's not kindness, that's imperial pragmatism, but it's still a major shift in tone. Esarhaddon also does the thing that makes Assyria's peak feel almost unreal. He conquers Egypt, which for Near Eastern powers is like trying to punch through a wall that always pushes you back. Egypt is distant, protected by geography, culturally cohesive, and very hard to hold. Esarhaddon manages to take Memphis in 671 BCE and forces Egypt into the Assyrian orbit. That achievement is part military, part logistics miracle, and part political manipulation, because even when you conquer Egypt, what you're really doing is trying to manage local rulers, rebellions, and distance. And that leads directly into Ashurbanipal, the last truly great Assyrian king, the one who shows the empire at its most impressive and also, quietly, at its most strained. Ashurbanipal is famous for two things that feel like they shouldn't coexist in one person. On the one hand, he's a ruthless war leader who fights brutal campaigns, including long conflicts that involve Elam, Babylonian politics, and the constant problem of keeping the empire coherent. On the other hand, he's the king of the library, the one whose collection at Nineveh preserves an enormous amount of Mesopotamian literature and scholarly text, myths, omens, rituals, medical texts, astronomical observations, epic stories like Gilgamesh. Basically, a whole intellectual universe that only survives as well as it does because an Assyrian king wanted it gathered, copied, and stored. This is the moment where you can say to your audience, look, the Assyrians weren't just destroying cultures, they were also curating them, often to serve their own authority, but still, they preserved a lot of what we know. And that's a deeply uncomfortable truth because it forces you to hold the empire in both hands, the hand that burns and the hand that archives. Now, let's talk about how this peak actually works day to day, because the Sargonids aren't just coasting on military victories, they're operating an imperial system that has to move information and force fast. The Assyrians run a communication network of messengers and relay stations that lets the king receive reports from governors and commanders across huge distances. They keep records obsessively. They monitor omens and politics like it's the same thing, because for them, divine signs are part of state intelligence. They maintain provincial administration that can tax, draft labor, deliver supplies, and punish rebellion. And they keep the army active, not just as a fighting force, but as a presence, like a reminder stamped onto the landscape. At this peak stage, Assyria is doing what later empires always do. It makes peripheral regions feed the center, and it uses the center's power to keep the periphery obedient. And it repeats the cycle until either the system becomes unstoppable or it becomes brittle. And you can already sense brittleness under the Sargonids, even while they're winning. Holding Egypt is difficult. Managing Babylon is emotionally and politically expensive. Fighting on multiple fronts means constant strain. Elite rivalries don't vanish just because the empire is huge. In fact, huge empires often intensify elite rivalries because the stakes are enormous. So even at the top, you get warning signs: heavy reliance on intimidation, the necessity of constant campaigning, the fact that one succession crisis could set off chain reactions. But let me not race ahead to collapse yet. We still need to sit with what peak looks like, because this is where Assyria's reputation is forged permanently. It's not just that they conquer, it's that they leave behind images. The palace reliefs, sieges, deportations, battle scenes, hunting scenes are propaganda, yes, but they are also the empire telling the world this is what power looks like. And that aesthetic becomes a kind of imperial language. Even the royal lion hunts matter here, because they're not just sport, they're staged symbols of the king subduing chaos, the king as the only person capable of protecting order. When you pair that symbolic world with real administrative control, you get an empire that feels total. And yet, paradoxically, the more total it feels, the more enemies it creates, because everyone who's been deported, humiliated, taxed, or ruled by fear has a reason to hate you, and hatred is a resource that your rivals can eventually organize. So the Sargonid peak is dazzling, horrifying, and incredibly fragile underneath the shine. The empire reaches the outer limits of what its system can manage. The kings are powerful enough to do the impossible, like taking Egypt and building Nineveh into a masterpiece of imperial architecture. And at the same time, they are fighting constant fires, literal and political, especially around Babylon and the southern heartland. So how does an empire that looks like the final boss of the ancient world, roads, armies, intelligence, terror, giant capitals, how does that thing fall so fast that within a generation it's basically gone? That's the question that makes the Assyrian story feel almost modern, because we've all seen versions of it. Institutions that seem permanent until they're suddenly not. A superpower that looks stable right up to the moment it can't control its own internal chaos. And with Assyria, the collapse really is fast in historical terms. We're talking about roughly 2 decades of free fall, where the empire goes from everyone pays tribute to the capital is burning. The most iconic date is 612 BCE, when Nineveh falls, but the real collapse is a chain reaction that starts earlier and keeps going after. And the hard truth is, there isn't one cause. It's a stack of problems that line up at the same time: internal fracture, overextension, exhausted legitimacy, and enemies who finally coordinate. If you want one word for it, it's brittleness. The empire is powerful, but it's also rigid, and rigidity is great until you need flexibility. One big driver is succession and civil conflict. Empires often die when they can't manage the transfer of power smoothly, and the Neo-Assyrian system, so centered on the king as the cosmic agent of Ashur, has a built-in vulnerability. If the king is weak, disputed, or contested, the whole structure loses coherence. After Ashurbanipal, the record gets messy. We know there are internal struggles and rival claimants. Elites fight, regions sense weakness. Governors who were loyal when the center was strong start hedging. And the thing about a highly centralized imperial machine is that when the center wobbles, everything wobbles with it. Provinces stop sending resources, garrisons become isolated, communication breaks down. The empire starts to lose its ability to respond quickly. And once you lose speed, you lose the intimidation factor. Fear works when it feels immediate. If the empire can't arrive fast, people risk rebellion. Another factor is overextension. And I don't mean that as a cliché. Assyria is running a system that demands constant campaigning and constant extraction. It's not just holding territory, it's enforcing obedience across huge distances. That's expensive, not only in silver and grain, but in political attention. You can't be everywhere at once, and the more fronts you have, the more chances you have to face a crisis that you can't fully address. Holding Egypt is notoriously difficult, but even closer zones, Babylonia, Elam, the Levant, are constant stress points. Babylon, in particular, is a repeating wound. Destroy it, rebuild it, suppress it, negotiate with it, no solution sticks forever. And every time Babylon is unstable, it drains Assyrian resources and legitimacy. Because Babylon isn't just another province, it's the cultural heavyweight of the south. If you mishandle Babylon, you don't just cause a rebellion, you damage your claim to be the rightful ruler of Mesopotamia. And that matters more than people think. Assyria's ideology depends on the sense that the king's victories prove divine favor. When victories become harder, when rebellions keep happening, the ideology starts to sound less like destiny and more like propaganda. And people can smell that shift. There's also the empire's own playbook coming back to haunt it. This is one of the most bitter ironies in history. Assyria creates a world of coerced populations, resentful elites, and displaced communities. And that world becomes a massive pool of potential allies for any coalition that wants to destroy Assyria. Terror creates obedience, yes, but it also creates hatred. Deportation breaks identities, yes, but it also spreads stories of suffering across the empire. Heavy tribute enriches the center, yes, but it also drains local economies and pushes local elites toward desperate choices. So when Assyria weakens, it doesn't face one enemy. It faces a whole region that has reasons to coordinate against it. And eventually, that coordination happens. The coalition that finally crushes Assyria is usually described as Medes and Babylonians. Medes from the Iranian plateau and Babylonians from the south, along with other groups who join the momentum. What matters is that for the first time in a long time, multiple major enemies are aligned in their interests. They all want Assyria gone, not contained, not humbled, gone. And when that kind of coalition forms, and when the imperial center is already fractured, you get a perfect storm. The war that ends Assyria is not one dramatic battle where the empire loses and bows out gracefully. It's a sequence of sieges, losses, and territorial collapse where the Assyrians are fighting on too many fronts with too little unity. Cities fall, lines of communication are cut. Assyria's ability to move armies quickly, the thing it was famous for, degrades. And then we arrive at the scene everyone remembers. Nineveh, the great capital, besieged and taken in 612 BCE. The image of Nineveh burning becomes a symbol because it feels like the world turning upside down. This city that had been the nerve center of terror and order is suddenly vulnerable. And once Nineveh is gone, the psychological power of Assyria collapses with it. Even if some Assyrian forces and remnants continue fighting from other centers for a few years, the heart is ripped out. The empire doesn't recover. It can't. The administrative machine is built around a functioning center, and when that center is destroyed, you don't just lose a city, you lose the empire's memory, archives, command structure, ritual legitimacy, supply hubs. You lose the Assyria is inevitable aura. And without that aura, provinces that were obedient out of fear start acting like independent states again. In other words, the empire doesn't just lose, it decomposes. Now, one thing that makes Assyria's collapse feel especially sudden is what happens afterward in cultural memory. Later empires exist in the same region, Babylonians, then Persians, then others, and they build on some Assyrian practices. But the Assyrians as a political identity fade quickly. Their cities become ruins, Their language continues in scholarly contexts, but the empire's name becomes almost a cautionary tale. That's why when the Bible talks about Nineveh as the city of blood, it's not describing a living superpower, it's describing a fallen monster. And that's also why, for many centuries, Assyria is half legend, half warning. People know it existed, they know it was terrifying, but they don't have the kind of continuous narrative that Rome has in Western memory. Assyria vanishes into the ground, literally. It takes archaeology in the modern era to bring Nineveh and Nimrud and the palace reliefs back into view. Another reason it feels fast is that Assyria doesn't have a clean successor state carrying its banner. Rome falls and the idea of Rome survives. The Assyrian Empire falls, and there is no Assyria 2.0 that rebuilds it as a national project. The administrative model lives on in others, but the Assyrian political identity is not revived in the same way. The new powers, especially the Neo-Babylonians and later the Persians, absorb, repurpose, and rewrite the region's story. So the empire's disappearance becomes part of its myth, the terror state that was swallowed by history. But if you step back, the collapse isn't magical. It's the predictable risk of an imperial system that is incredibly effective at control, but heavily dependent on constant success, constant extraction, and a stable center. When the center cracks and enemies coordinate, the empire's strengths become weaknesses. A machine that demands perfect functioning can't survive prolonged malfunction. So the final image of Nineveh burning is dramatic, yes, but it's also the end of a long buildup of strain. Strain created partly by external pressures, partly by internal politics, and partly by the very methods that made Assyria powerful in the first place. So what's left when the palaces burn and the king's names stop being spoken out loud? With Assyria, the obvious answer is ruins. And that's true. Nineveh becomes a scar on the landscape. Nimrud turns into broken stone. And for a long time, the empire lives more as a warning story than a remembered civilization. But the deeper answer is that Assyria leaves behind a method, a blueprint, a set of habits about how you rule a large, diverse world when you don't have the luxury of everyone sharing your language, your gods, your laws, or your willingness to cooperate. And if that sounds like a modern problem, that's exactly why Assyria matters. They didn't invent empire in the sense of being the first people to conquer someone. Humans were conquering before Assyria. What they did invent, what they pioneered more consistently than anyone before them, was the combination of conquest with durable administration, and then the ability to repeat that combination year after year across a huge territory. In other words, a superpower with a system, not just a strong king with an army. That's why I keep calling them the first true empire in the way people usually mean it. They built an imperial operating system, and then later empires ran versions of it. Let's break that legacy down into a few pieces that you can actually see echoing forward. First, provincial administration. The Neo-Assyrians didn't just demand tribute and walk away. They learned to convert regions into provinces, install governors, collect taxes and labor obligations systematically, and keep the whole thing connected to the capital through reporting. That sounds basic to us now, but in the ancient world, it's revolutionary because it turns conquered space into governed space. When the Persians later build their empire, they do something similar with satrapies. The details differ. Persian rule often looks less visibly terror-driven and more about accommodation, but the basic idea that you can manage far-flung territories through a standardized provincial framework is straight out of the Assyrian playbook. Second, communication networks. Assyria's power depended on speed, Messengers, relays, roads, constant reports from governors and commanders. An empire isn't just an army, it's information. If you can't learn about a rebellion in time, you don't have an empire, you have a rumor. The Assyrians understood that. Later empires, from the Persians with their famous courier system to Rome with its roads, lean into the same truth. Control is partly about the movement of information. Third, the military as an institution, not an event. One of the big shifts we talked about with Tiglath-Pileser III is that the Assyrian army becomes more professional and permanent. Again, this isn't modern professional army in the strictest sense, but it is a move toward a standing force that can be deployed reliably with specialists, siege capabilities, logistics, and discipline. This changes what a state can do. It can campaign more often, farther away, and with more predictable outcomes. You see later empires copying this in their own contexts, not necessarily the same units or weapons, but the idea that the military is a permanent arm of state power, not just seasonal militia duty. Fourth, siege warfare and heavy engineering. Assyria becomes famous for taking cities that other states would struggle with. They develop and refine siege methods, ramming, undermining walls, towers, coordinated assaults, combined with psychological pressure. This isn't just brutality, it's technical skill. And that skill spreads. You can track a broader Near Eastern tradition of siegecraft that later powers inherit and refine. Fifth, and this is the most uncomfortable legacy, population management as policy. Deportations, resettlement, mixing peoples, breaking local power bases. Assyria makes this a routine instrument of imperial control. Later empires do similar things in their own ways. Sometimes it's forced migration, sometimes it's colonization, sometimes it's moving veterans into conquered lands, sometimes it's enslaving and relocating labor. The Assyrians aren't the last to think of humans as movable parts in a state machine, but they're one of the first to apply it on a scale that feels systematic. That's why the Assyrian shadow is so long. Now, if we zoom out even more, there's a bigger legacy that's less about specific policies and more about the concept of power. Assyria teaches the ancient world a harsh lesson. Scale wins. If you can coordinate resources across a huge territory, you can overwhelm smaller states, even if those states are brave, wealthy, or culturally prestigious. The Levantine kingdoms learn it the hard way. Babylon learns it, then uses it later. The Medes and Babylonians who destroy Assyria learn it too, because the moment they inherit the ruins, they also inherit the idea that a large, centralized state can dominate the region. In that sense, Assyria doesn't just conquer land, it changes the political imagination of the Near East. After Assyria, the idea of a regional superpower is normal. People start acting like someone will rule everybody is just how the world works. That's a psychological shift, and it's one of the reasons historians keep pointing back to Assyria as a turning point. We began with Nineveh as the city of blood, with the Assyrians as ancient villains, and we asked, what happened to them? How does a people go from merchants to conquerors? Assyria is a story about insecurity becoming ideology. A small state in a dangerous neighborhood survives by being organized. That organization generates strength. Strength creates ambition. Ambition, when paired with trauma and fear of vulnerability, turns into the belief that control is the only safety. And once a state believes that, it starts doing things like terror, deportation, permanent war that make safety feel real in the short term, but also make enemies everywhere. The empire becomes powerful, and in the process it becomes hated, and that hatred eventually becomes a coalition, and that coalition burns the capital. The tragedy is that Assyria builds a world-spanning system to prevent humiliation, and in the end it experiences the ultimate humiliation, collapse, so total that later generations barely remember it until archaeologists pull it back into the light. And yet, even that isn't the end, because the Assyrian method survives in the empires that come after. It survives in the idea that power can be standardized, that administration can be scaled, that communication can be weaponized, that fear can be managed, that diversity can be governed, sometimes violently, sometimes pragmatically, often both. So when we call Assyria the first empire, we're not just giving them a trophy, we're acknowledging something darker and more important. They showed the world how empire works. They built the prototype. And once the prototype exists, everyone else, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and beyond, has to decide what to copy, what to soften, and what to deny they copied at all. That's why Assyria still matters, not because we want to admire them, and not because we want to demonize them, but because their story forces us to look at empire as a human invention, built by choices, shaped by fear, powered by organization, and paid for in lives. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.